All right, welcome everybody to another author chat on SFF Addicts. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Samit Basu. He's an Indian novelist, film director, and screenwriter. His written works include the GameWorld Trilogy, Turbulence, Resistance, and more. And his debut film, House Arrest, was released as part of Netflix's International Originals in 2019, which he wrote and co-directed with Shashanka Ghosh. And Samit has also been working in comic books, writing for series Devi, collaborating with M.R. Carey on Untouchables, and contributing to Grant Morrison's 18 Days. And his latest novel is The City Inside, originally published in 2020 as Chosen Spirits, but now re-releasing through Tordotcom Publishing. So welcome to the show, Samit. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, and thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. My pleasure.
As we were saying before we started, I mean, it's amazing the links that we can now have across time zones and literally across the world in this case.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you're in India and I'm in Ecuador, and the fact that we can just kind of like merge together and chat is unbelievable.
I mean, I never stop being surprised by it. I really never do. Even though the pandemic has kind of trained us all in this in these new forms of communication and kind of normalizing
it's desensitized us to the majesty and wonder that is this technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and before we get into the interview proper, I want to say congrats on the release of The City Inside. So, how are you feeling about the release and how everything's going in terms of reception leading up to that?
Thank you. It's been very exciting because I've been broadly working in the creative spheres for about 20 years now. It's all I've done my entire adult life, and I have to say this is the first time that a book of mine is getting a fair shot from a big publisher in the US, and that's always a huge thing for any artist when they kind of manage to travel to the largest marketplace and meet new readers and all the many wonderful people who are kind of in the field, around the field. It's quite a magical thing, and because I've managed to kind of stagger out kind of slow journeys in many fields and kind of many countries over the years, it's been kind of, you learn to appreciate every part of it. So the whole process with Tordotcom so far has been really amazing because they're at the top of their game in terms of just their publishing process. Watching the reaction of people to the books that they're bringing out has been amazing as well. And there are just so many new perspectives and new things to enjoy every day as we head there.
Yeah, and I mean, just from my experiences working with the publicists over at Tor, they're all so chill, very welcoming people, and very enthusiastic about the stuff that they're putting out there. Like the collaborations that they have with the authors, they're very excited to get the word out and pitch the book to people and just spread the word about awesome fiction, which I mean, as a lover of fiction myself, as a writer, as someone who's doing this podcast and all this different kind of stuff, like for me, that is so addictive to get that enthusiasm from other people.
Absolutely.
And first, I want to get to know you a bit more, and I like to ask this to all the authors that I chat with, but give listeners and viewers a better sense of the real Samit Basu. So what was your relationship with reading and SFF like when you were growing up?
Right. Well, I mean, I've been reading all the time, all through my life. And the thing with SFF is that growing up in India in the 80s and 90s, we didn't have bookshops that were separated by genre at all. And the genre of works that traveled to India at the time were mostly British books. So my first experiences were your Tolkien when I was a preteen, which I just fell in love with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings when I was 10 or 11 or sometime. I don't even know how many times I read those books. And then things like Hitchhiker's Guide. There was Asimov sometime in middle school in my library and so on. But for me, what really kind of got me even more absorbed into it was reading Discworld when I was in my mid-teens and my late teens, because there were so many of those books and they were going in so many different directions and doing things that just open up your world as a reader as well. And so I've always read across genres and I've always consumed things across media. So we didn't really understand the sort of partitions between different branches of storytelling so much when I was growing up. So
Hmm.
when it came to understanding that science fiction and fantasy were separate partitions of the arts in themselves and not just a useful way to describe books. Um, that was something that took some adjustment too, because even when I was writing my first novel 20 years ago, um, I understood that it was a fantasy novel, but I had no idea about publishing anywhere in the world, and I certainly didn't understand that it was a completely different ecosystem divided by genre, um, and sort of the social implications of that, not just in India but also all over the world. So that's been a process of continuous adjustment, because if you don't grow
Yeah.
up with with a specific stream of books or movies or shows or whatever, and you just consume everything equally, then understanding the sort of the different flows of different kinds of storytelling can be a bit of a struggle.
That is kind of a nice thing though, to be blissfully ignorant of genre and that kind of classification, because obviously it is something that is developed for marketing purposes
Yeah,
primarily.
yeah,
But for you, just based on the social circumstances of growing up in India, those genres didn't really permeate to the point where you were able to clearly define such and such thing. So for me, it's like that must have been kind of you know a beautiful thing to just know that, like, just fiction in general was this thing that you could love and absorb and consume and really start to develop a fascination and an adoration for, as opposed to like when I was growing up in Canada, it was just uh there was negative stigma towards certain things, like, "Oh, you're reading fantasy, blah, 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 blah," and that's kinda something that I, like, hid just based on that fact, until something like Harry Potter came and just blew everything out of the water, and nobody really gave a shit anymore about, uh, fantasy, because it was like, this is like a broader mainstream appeal kinda thing. But, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you say that, and then obviously later on in your life, you say you're still sort of, like, struggling with um the classifications of that kind of stuff and sort of realigning your perspective on it. Yeah.
absolutely. Because I mean, I didn't. What's been interesting as well is finding that readers who also haven't been trained to filter things by genre, and this is over the decades. It's not just for my generation. Um, So when I first started doing book events in India, for example, I found that the demographic of people who were coming to these were not at all what you would expect the stereotypes of genre readers to be.
Mhm.
Because people who are just open to reading anything and they hear of something that sounds interesting in concept and they'll come and read it, absolutely do not have this understanding of, I'm flying the flag of cyberpunk or I'm flying the flag of steampunk,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
there are sort of social divisions between all of this. But so my first encounter with all of this was when I encountered publishing for the first time, and
Yeah.
found that many years ago, found that people were going to be dismissive of the work because it didn't fit into the norms of what Indian literary fiction was supposed to be. And understanding that that was not a phase and that was something that was always going to be there in the background of the writing or the work in any field was something that certainly took a certain amount of time to process. And even now, I mean, even The City Inside, for example, it's a book where I thought for a lot of time about what genre it really was. um,
Yeah.
and as has always happened with my book, after a point of time, I gave up and just let the story tell itself. And, then you look at it from the outside and see, okay, I think this is science fiction. I wanted it to be science fiction, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think that's a good approach though. It's kind of like let the story tell itself, let it come naturally, flow out of your brain, and genre classifications and all that crap will come later on, and
Yeah.
people will label it themselves. Even like one person would potentially say, like, it's cyberpunk or post cyberpunk or something along those lines. Someone might say it's like near future sci-fi, what
Yeah.
have you. So it's like all that kind of stuff is a bit nebulous anyways. But when you were starting off, what were some of you said your first book was fantasy. Tell me a bit more about that, but then also your GameWorld Trilogy is I'm not sure if that was the first one,
Yeah.
or if
Yeah.
that. So tell me a bit more about that and where your idea for that series originated, and then what compelled you to start telling stories in the fantasy realm as opposed to, say, science fiction or something else?
Right. Well, so when I was writing that book, when I started writing that book, when I was, I think, 22 was when I wrote my draft, and before that, I dropped very dramatically out of this business school in India, where I had landed up because I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. So for us growing up there, it was kind of, you had these there were these sort of successful streams that you went down if you were reasonably good at taking exams and pretending that you knew anything about anything. So for my generation, it was like a wave of doctors and engineers has already gone out to the world, and now we are sending MBAs. So my friends and I all kind of drifted into business schools without any kind of particular desire to be there, but just because it was where you went. And
Right.
also, throughout my life, I just loved books so much and movies and shows, and I always wanted to do something in the arts, but it's not something that you could really do in my generation in India, where you didn't really have the choice of doing something that you liked for a living. That whole idea was something that came into
Right.
later generations. But I'd always promised myself that if I had an idea that I thought could turn into a book, and I'd known since I was a child that if I could write a book, that's really all I wanted to do. Um, so I promised myself that if I had a thing that I knew could be a book, I would drop whatever I was doing and write it. Unfortunately, this happened about 2 weeks into my first term at business school. So I'd
Good timing.
uh, terrible timing. And it's not, you couldn't even really tell people that you were doing this to write a book, because everyone would just think you were crazy. So only the
Mm,
people very close to me knew, and I think everyone else just thought I'd had some kind of nervous breakdown and I was sitting in my room and kind of counting stars or something like that. And what led to the book becoming fantasy was really that. So we were also kind of trained to think that nothing about our own lives was interesting. Um, that and This was following a wave of Indian books kind of reaching out to the world, but they were all talking about really kind of heavy, important literary themes to do with um, colonialism, partition, the terrible social circumstances we have here. And I certainly didn't have the kind of gravitas that is needed to pull off that kind of book. Nor was it the kind of book that really spoke to me. There are books
right.
that you admire, and there are books that you love. And for me, the
Yeah.
books that I love had always been, The Lord of the Rings, Hitchhiker's Guide, Discworld, world mythology, fables. That whole sense of unrestrained imaginations just running wild when you can't see the borders that surround them, but you just love this idea of freedom that you can get if you can just kind of let go
Right.
and create. So I decided to write a book that would be that would bring together the 200 stories that I had loved most, but to kind of patch them into a plot that was mine and a setting that was mine. So I wrote this 500-page fantasy novel, which is kind of Discworldy. The first one was called The Simulcan Prophecies, but it was like a Discworld where all your different segments of things are Asian, African, um, Mediterranean culture-based fantasy with one token white guy. Um, in
Gotta have the
in this,
token white guy in there.
yeah. So and it was just this joyous experience writing it. And fortunately, it was at a time where India as a country was in that time looking to open up to the world. It was trying interesting new things. The Lord of the Rings movies were just out. Harry Potter was a big deal everywhere in the world, and so Penguin, which is the largest publisher here, um, decided to take a chance on it. And to everyone's surprise, it did very well, and that kind of set me off on the path of no return, where I now find myself here, 20
Yeah.
years later.
That's awesome though, because I mean, you really took your influences to heart, but at the same time, from my outsider's perspective, I look at a country like India and its mythology and folklore and stuff like that, and it's so rich and there's just a fascinating wealth of history there, and then you pulled from a bunch of different regions of the world in terms of their mythology and their folklore, and I just found that fascinating, and I really really enjoyed it. And for you, personally, what are a few of your favorite mythological creatures and why?
Mythological creatures. Well, I think there's the range of diverse dragons will always kind of be a top category in itself, and
Hmm.
the difference between, say, a Norse dragon and a Chinese dragon um, was something that I found so interesting even as a child. And I learned very late in life that we had our own dragons in India, which were made up by Greek travelers when they were clearly chilling out somewhere and pretending that they'd been to India and seen all manner of magical things. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think for me, the dragons are a big deal. From India, my favorite creatures are always going to be the big villains of all our epics, which is the Rakshasas, which are these kind of they're very what you'd call soft magic system creatures, in the sense
Hmm.
that some can grow to vast sizes, some can shapeshift, they can all travel in the air. They're just these very freelancer, multi-powered creatures, a bit
Yeah.
like the jinn uh,
Yes.
from Arab folklore, which are my other top bracket of creatures. They're all very hard to define, and I like that about them because it means you can take them and kind of shape them into a specific creature for a specific story and just have fun with it.
That was my thought exactly. That it's like you could take that creature and apply it to your story and sort of, you know, shift it around based on
Yeah.
the necessities of whatever your narrative is presenting, whatever challenges your characters are facing, and that kind of thing. And so then later on, what drew you to write about superheroes? I mean, you mentioned that you're really into like comics and movies when you were younger as well. But for Turbulence and Resistance, what was it about superheroes that spoke to you enough to write two novels about it?
Well, this was, I think, in 2009, 2010, and I just spent most of my 20s writing this large fantasy trilogy. Um, and I wanted to sort of, look around and write something that was completely based on contemporary things, set in the real world, because I spent many years just inventing this massive world and going down many historical roads, and I was a bit tired. So that 2009, I think, was around when the Marvel Cinematic Universe was just taking off, and I thought
Hmm.
it would be interesting to sort of look at. And this was also a time where we'd been sold the propaganda, really, that India was going to be this huge country on the world scale, on the world stage. And it was always, no one really believed that India was going to be a superpower in 10 years or something. But I thought I would take these kind of cultural aspirations that we'd spent our teenage years believing, um, and look at global pop culture and how we could fit into it. And I started thinking, what would happen if you had, say, an X-Men like team or an Avengers like team, suddenly through a mysterious event, gaining superpowers in India. And it's also the thing about how a superhero mostly is someone who is essentially there to preserve the status quo. Um, but if you're in a part of the world that needs radical change more than it needs protection, um, then how do you decide what to do with the abilities that you have? And what would you do
Yeah,
if
true.
you actually had the power to change the world instead of just complaining about it, which is a very justified activity and one I
Hmm.
spend a lot of my time doing. But if you actually had the power to change the world, what would you do when it was time? So it was an exploration of these questions, and I had a lot of fun writing it. And it was also the first. It was also the first book of mine. Turbulence was the first book that found a publisher in the West, which was funny because also it was really glad to. I was really glad that the book was traveling, and it also involved the characters traveling to London to find global attention. So it
Hmm.
was it was it was a fun meta thing for me to do as well.
Yeah, just sort of a parallel to your own writing career because that was with Titan Books,
That was
I
with
think,
Dragon
right?
Books. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's a UK based publisher, so it's really cool. So it's like you have this parallel of your superheroes, your X Men team, and their journey to London, just as you did with your publishing career. And you actually touched on something that was kind of on my mind in terms of superheroes. From your perspective, how do superheroes serve as um, a reflection of our modern society? You brought up how, in North America, for instance, superheroes might be viewed through the lens of protection, protectors, that kind of thing. Whereas in India, it's like, what does an Indian superhero necessitate based on how their society is reflecting on them now that they have these new abilities and all that kind of stuff. So for you, what is it like in terms of reflecting India, but also playing with concepts of good versus evil, or even the moral grayness that kind of shifts in between?
Well, it was interesting then, and it's also interesting that it would be completely different now if I wrote it now, because at the time India was still a country that was looking to globalize, and looking to find its place on the world map. Whereas now it's become incredibly kind of conservative and inward looking, and the state of democracy, to put it mildly, is not very good at the moment. So at the time, it was really more about translating your local culture into a global experience. Whereas I think now it would be much more about doing very drastic and unpleasant things to kind of get your in crisis world kind of back on track, which kind of is where I ended up going in the city inside.
Yeah.
Um, it's always very interesting for me to sort of start out at the stage before I outline, with these fairly specific but also broad themes, and then by the time I end up in the actual book, and I know who the characters are and what they're doing, of course I try and forget all of that, because then it's much more important for the characters to just be themselves and to be in the
Hmm.
situation that they're in, and my authorial meta layers really aren't important at that stage. So I hope they kind of you know trickle in at some stage through the definition of what the characters of the story is. So,
Hmm.
in terms of actually heading towards answering what you asked, which I realize I haven't been doing, it's
Roundabout way
uh,
is a good way, anyways. It's all good.
yeah, I don't think I would tell a superhero story out of India right now. Um,
Hmm.
but at that point, it was really about um, you know looking at all the good powers were taken for a start, right? So it was about finding abilities for these characters that could be really transformative for the millennia old social problems that we have. Um, Measuring that against the even then there was this, the fame culture had really spread in, and the idea of superheroes as celebrities was also something that I found interesting, because what happens to people when they become famous, or when they're given
Right.
responsibilities they have no expertise in, um, and when they simply don't understand what's going on in the world around them, but they have good intentions and abilities now which they didn't before. So it was really about playing with these and trying to see if I could fit it into the kind of the touchstones of what you might think is a superhero story arc, like the origin story arc of a superhero movie.
Yeah.
um, or there's been so much amazing work in comics, just about the many complexities of what superheroes can be and what they can mean to society and what they face. So it was really a problem of plenty in terms of just take a whole bunch of ideas and see what works for these characters in this situation in this time.
Yeah. No, that's cool. And you just mentioned comics. You've as I said in the intro, you also did work for comics here and there. So can you share some of your experiences from that, and how does writing for the comic medium compare to writing a novel, for instance? And we spoke before we started recording just about all my artwork here, and how there's this crazy collaboration between like the visual side and the textual side of comics, and how that all kind of comes together in a unified final product.
Well, so growing up, also, just like I didn't have any understanding of genre boundaries, I also didn't understand medium boundaries at all. I really thought everything was art, and
Yeah.
all that mattered was how anything made me feel as I consumed it or read it. So comics was something where I did not think I would ever get to do, because for the simple fact that I cannot draw at all, which is why the wall behind you fills me with so much envy. And so I admire talent in all its forms, but I also deeply envy it, especially when it's art and it's music, because the journey of art or music into the brain of someone who's looking at it or listening to it is so immediate, and you can tell whether you love it or you don't relate to it in 1 second. So the emotional connection you form to either art or music is right there. Um,
Yeah.
for consuming long form prose, it takes a bit of time, and it requires it. I mean, it doesn't require external shaping, but it's very affected by external shaping. Um, you need to spend a bit of time inside the world that's created to really figure out what your relationship with it
Yeah.
is. And you can't really see it or listen to it immediately and go, okay, I love this. This is me now. So when I think around 2006 or so, and at this point, I think two books were out. They were doing well. Um, and interesting work was coming in, because it was an interesting time in India, because there were lots of these big entertainment companies which were opening up India offices, and I kind of became the default science fiction fantasy guy. Um, you found if you Googled who can we find to actually make these things in this country. So when I got an email out of nowhere, and a lot of my career has been emails out of nowhere for really strange things which I find extremely exciting. And this was one where I said, "Would you like to do comics?" Said this company that had come to India with a whole bunch of celebrity names attached. Said, "I would love to do comics. Do I tell them now that I can't draw, or is that something that we find out together?" Um, and they
Surprise.
said, "We, it's terrible." and no, but they had this whole studio, and they had all these artists, and they needed someone to kind of come in and fix a story that they were struggling a bit with, and which is why they were looking out. And so wandering into the other arts has been so fascinating, because it's not like you lose books if you try anything else, but every other medium will teach you so much about just storytelling, and trying to fit that into the other mediums that you work in, and trying to kind of evolve an overall process where your principles are coming from diverse sources is a really exciting experience. So I was lucky enough to be working with an editor who had previously done time at Marvel and was now the chief editor for this. Um,
Nice.
so, just the first three drafts of the first comic strip I wrote were so exciting creatively, because you learn to think differently, and you learn to completely reframe your storytelling process. And it's a crash course on this, because you have deadlines and you're getting paid to do this. Um, so it's really like going to school. The difference between um, creating a book where you really have to define everything that the reader experiences, and just you know thinking spatially and thinking visually, and thinking about how something will look and not just how it feels, um, is such an exciting experience to learn how to do that kind of visual thinking, and to kind of make room for the artists to be themselves, and to elevate the work to a level that it could not have been had it just been text. Um,
Hmm.
it's, I think, also the best way to learn screenwriting, because
Yeah, that's true.
even that is a complete leap into the dark, and there you have even less control. So often it can be challenging for people who work with prose, where they, in the end, they really decide what's going on the page. um, Screenwriting can be a bit traumatic, because you have no control over anything. um, comics is a nice middle ground, because you are still the writer of it.
Hmm.
um, so the responsibility for the story is still in your hands. But
Yeah.
I was very happy to find that there a lot of writers have this problem where they think of the artist as an illustrator, not realizing that the artist has their own storytelling, that at a visceral level is perhaps more important than the text that's going in, depending on the kind of
Yeah.
reader that you have and the kind of story that it is. So just learning that one is able to collaborate successfully in something that is so personal and so important when you're writing it, right? Because when you're telling a story, it is a very pure act some sense. It is something that gives you joy
Yeah.
when you're doing it. So that was really encouraging to find out that collaboration is something that I can do when it's my work, and so which is why I've kind of explored opportunities that have come up whenever they've come up.
Yeah, I mean, that totally agree. It's like, respecting that the visual medium is also its own form of storytelling, and you know I'm really happy to hear that you came to this point of understanding, like, yeah, I can collaborate in this way and do it successfully and have a really good time and learn throughout the whole process. And as you mentioned, that also applies to screenwriting and film. And so what has your experience in film been like, working on house arrest and that whole process, and how that compares to what everything else that you've experienced in terms of comics or novels and that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, in film, you have to filter in the fact that it's been Bollywood, which is, I mean, take all the chaotic stories you've heard about Hollywood, um, and multiply them by a huge factor.
Really?
Uh, so for me, I mean, film is the work itself is amazing. It is so lovely to be part of a huge team where there are so many people who are absolutely essential to making anything happen on any given day. And I now understand why any film is bad,
Yeah.
um, because it is a miracle actually that anyone managed to make anything, because you need 100 stars to align for something good to happen. So
Yeah.
for me, my defining memories of film are actually I'm really relieved that I managed to get one film made, but my list of my list of failed film projects is truly spectacular. I mean, just I think I've spent around um, 10 to 12 years just failing at getting anything to shoot, because the cultural differences that you have as a as a fantasy science fiction writer who's trying to follow a certain set of guidelines in storytelling, or even say a comics writer who's um, trying to do a set of stories that works anywhere but is also broadly constrained by, say, your comics guidelines that are coming out of America broadly. um,
Right.
but in film, Bollywood really has its own universe and its own very strict laws of operation. And the differences between that are probably more than anything I've faced in, say, writing books that come out elsewhere in the world. So one day I'm going to write this book called 101 Bollywood Meetings. Um, but I'm
A
and
memoir.
yeah, and yeah, and which is, I mean, which is going to be about failed projects, because there have been so many, and they have all been so kind of unbelievable in themselves. The
Mhm.
reasons why they fell apart.
And
So
how exactly did Netflix come into the picture? Because obviously this was part of their sort of like international original. So not sure if it has some connection to Bollywood and studios in India, but in collaboration with Netflix. How did that whole thing come about?
yeah, so Netflix and the other streaming platforms have brought a very interesting wave to India, because there's a combination of the chaotic but functional processes of Bollywood and the processes of your large international corporation, which has its own bureaucracies and its own kind of
Hmm.
demands, which aren't necessarily the same as the film industry here. So after a lot of churning and a lot of clashing, essentially it's Bollywood people adapting to Netflix rules. But it
Mm.
also creates a whole set of opportunities, because you don't necessarily have to make films that conform either to what big Bollywood's demands are, or to what the more kind of international festival circuits demands are. And each
True.
has its own set of constraints and rules and all of that. So and I think it's only because Netflix arrived that I got to make something in the first place. In this case, the reason this film got made was basically that they wanted to work with my co-director Shashank, who's a very successful filmmaker in his own right. And we had this script which I had been kind of clinging to for a long time, because it was so small that they couldn't say that they couldn't let me direct it. So my screenwriting history has been one which has gone from really epic ambitions, and really big sort of epic sci-fi fantasy stories, to a film that
Yeah.
was so small that I could have shot it in my own flat, with two actors. which really has been my Bollywood journey more than anything else. And so they wanted to work with him. He didn't have anything he wanted to give them. I had this, and I was not willing to let it go. In the sense, I was not willing to just say, "You direct it, take my script and do it." I'm going to
Mhm.
cling on grimly to this because I want one IMDb credit. Um,
It's my
and so we
dream.
had, and so yeah, so we had this very very fun but very chaotic journey where we actually shot this film inside a single flat, which was far more challenging than anyone thought it would be, but it was also great fun. I will probably do more Bollywood work, but what happens is every time I work on a film project, I miss writing books desperately because you're just working on something that is just you.
Yeah.
Um, and whenever I spend a lot of time writing books, it's like I will be broke soon. I better do some film work. So kind of kind of bouncing between these two extremes is where the career has been for the last few years.
I mean, it's not a bad thing though. It's like you're giving yourself the mental headspace to go from one end of the spectrum to the other in terms of like intense collaboration, and you're probably by the end of that just fucking fed up and like I just want to be by myself and write a book, and then you go
Yes.
back to writing a book. Obviously comics is a bit of a middle ground. It's a bit more intimate collaboration, not
Yeah.
as intense as filmmaking or what have you, but you straddled the line between these different mediums such that you can curb any burnout or anything like that, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it's either that or you have multiple burnouts at the same time, and I'm never sure. I'm never sure which one it is, but as long as I'm still working, it's good because I'm also conscious of the fact that I've had a career that is very difficult to have if you're from this country. So while I will always be complaining about everything, I also feel like I've been lucky in ways that a lot of people have not been.
Yeah.
So which is part of the reason why there's always more energy to do more things because having gotten the opportunities I have, I shouldn't not do them.
Yeah. And then when it comes to The City Inside, you mentioned earlier that one, if you were to write a superhero book today, it's like you don't think you could really do it because your uh anxieties and the things that are going on in Indian society are much different than when you originally wrote Turbulence. So for you, what was kind of like the impetus to write at that point was Chosen Spirits. And then what was the journey like? How did that then get picked up by Tor.com to then be published as The City Inside?
Right. Well, the starting point of the book that was at first Chosen Spirits was that I'd been finding for many years this growing sense of immense anxiety at how the whole world was going, in the sense that, I think everyone has this as they grow a bit older. Most of my friends have kids now, and I can see that suddenly they're connecting to the world in states of panic that they had not when they were themselves causing other people worry. Um, so so I thought I would put these it's not just growing anxieties and fears about the state of the world, but it's also about what am I as an individual supposed to do about this, in the sense that how am I supposed to, one, cope with the many challenges of the world around me, but two, also try and find a way where I can use whatever privileges and abilities I have to improve the environments of um, any space where I can, and to improve the lives of the people I care about instead of just being in survival mode all the time. So the thing is, and the news, both real and fake, has been so terrible, and I think this is a global thing right now. Because in many ways, every society, if you look around, is facing the same challenges because the
Right.
multiple choice apocalypses that are heading our way are ones that are affecting the whole planet, and the whole planet is interconnected in ways that hasn't been before. Um,
Hmm.
so I started thinking about you know the people who are growing up now, the people who are now teenagers and children, growing up in a world that is different from the one I grew up in so radically in so many ways, and they do not have the same set of illusions and the same set of dreams and fears that I did. Um, what would they be like when they were at an age when they were kind of able to impact the worlds around them in certain ways. What were the compromises they would have to make in terms of their own safety and their own family's safeties in a world that was always looking to control and manipulate and push them into directions that they didn't necessarily want to go. Because for a lot of people around the world, there is safety and there is success in looking away from the bad things that are happening very near them.
100%. Yeah.
So it was really about what would people broadly of my level of privilege or people above my level of privilege, how were they going to cope with with the future if they had the right intentions and they had a certain amount of ability, but they just didn't know what to believe and what to do and who they were in the first place. So
Right.
the book started out. I mean, my plan for it was actually for it to be a multi-part, much more cyberpunky, much more action-driven. There'll be a revolution. There'll be all the exciting things that you expect from you know overcoming a dystopian scenario or
Mm-hmm.
being in technologically enabled and visually colorful Asian settings. But as I was writing the book, that just didn't feel right because it would be like I was writing from a distance. Um, but I was writing while pretty much in the middle of the world that I was describing. And there is no technological solution for ancient social problems because it takes multi-generational, social, political, community-led, sustainable change.
Yeah.
So, which is why the book so my choices were really either to make it something that I was distant from and have a kind of very exciting, technologically advanced, shall we say, storyline, or to immerse further into the world I was already in and to kind of
Mm-hmm.
compress it to a point where, I could create a really stressful individual environment and see the journeys of these two characters as they found out who they were and what they could do and what they felt they needed to do, and kind of escape the constant surveillance and the constant distraction that the world around them was giving them. So it was a very intense writing process because it took much longer than any previous book because like a fool I decided to write it in the near future. And also, like a fool, I decided to base it off nonfiction and the news.
Yeah.
And so I constructed this whole future history of South Asia for the next many years. And the news kept not obeying me for some reason. It kept, it kept like disasters which were supposed to happen 3 years from now kept happening next week.
Yeah.
Um, so it was an interesting process because the characters were who they were and they were going through the journey that they were going through, but the world behind them was constantly shifting. um, because I was writing about foundational events that would be 10 years in the past for the characters in the book. And
Mm-hmm.
I had this goal that I wanted to make it as real as possible and also as optimistic as possible because I didn't want this is not a place where I want to say, oh, things are very bad and everything is very dystopian and
Mm-hmm.
everyone is doomed. I wanted to see how people could find hope and a direction to go towards and motivation in this sort of time. And also I wanted to make it funny because you're going through life and no matter how stressful things are also hilarious. um,
Yeah.
so it was a complicated set of guidelines and directions to follow. And then it came out here. Of course there was a helpful pandemic. So it was published here. It was published here, I think, a few months into the pandemic. So there was that. But the book did very well. The book because I didn't tell anyone what genre it was. It was nominated for India's biggest literary fiction award,
Oh, wow.
and it also sold fine considering it was the pandemic. And then the long, slow process of finding an agent and a publisher in the West began. And at this point, I didn't know if the world was going to be around in a few months for the book to find anything, right? So I was delighted and I was very surprised when I both found an agent and a publisher for this book because it really doesn't really doesn't hit the marks you're expected to hit as as Indian fantasy or Indian science fiction. There's a
Mm-hmm.
certain set of marks which you are expected at a distant level to hit. And this book is not about those things at all. So I was really, really thrilled when I found an agent whose other clients I really kind of admire, and a publisher who's publishing a lot of my favorite writers in the world right now. Because I've also been, reading much more specifically into science fiction and fantasy over the last 4 or 5 years. And the range of work that's out there is incredible. And the evolution of the field that has happened since the mid 2010s has been something that I'm very proud to be a part of now.
Yeah, and I think it's good because it's a very good time for, you know, uh Western audiences, Western readers to be introduced to more global fiction. And at the same time, I think, you you hit on the fact that, the Indian marks in terms of what is expected in terms of fantasy or science fiction or what have you. This book is a little bit more experimental in the way that it's paced and presented and everything like that, which I think Western audiences perhaps are more open to, reading stuff that is not fitting into a typical mold or expectations that they've had for a long time or what have you. And at the same time, you're presenting India to them, you're presenting New Delhi in a way that, someone from the United States or wherever might not necessarily have any inkling or any experience with what that city is like, what Indian culture is like. So it's this really fascinating window into Indian culture. But I think a lot of the underlying stuff that you mentioned, some of the growing anxieties that people are feeling in terms of, surveillance or social media or, you know, uh, the influencer culture that is developing around social media, but at the same time, presenting it in such a way that is, you know, genuine and mildly satirical makes it very approachable for someone like me to be like, okay, I've actually been to New Delhi and I know what it's like. But at the same time, to get the insider's perspective that you mentioned, digging deeper into this world that you are embedded in, and at the same time, presenting it in this package that is like cool, relatable characters who are kind of going through the day-to-day shit of their lives, but at the same time being really genuine and genuine about it, and sometimes having a laugh about it, and sometimes getting into situations that are a little bit comical, for me was very uh refreshing. And for you, I'm curious, like, what is it like to um put a bit more of a spotlight on your home, on India, on New Delhi?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. That was really kind of you, and I was so delighted to hear all of that. So thank you very much. Um, yeah, it was interesting for. I've never really seen places as very different from one another, apart from the fact that it's some 40 something degrees Celsius in
Yeah.
Delhi right now, and that people look a little different. But sort of the idea of say a city like New York or London, um, the imaginary New York or London that everyone creates in their head from reading a lifetime's of books or seeing films and all of that, and the
Mhm.
realities of living there, uh,
Yeah.
if they actually move, are such an interesting contrast for people who do it. Like the London that I lived in for a year as a student was really not the London that I had seen in a book or a film, except when I was doing the touristy thing. So there
Yeah.
is that. So one of the challenges of being a writer from any place, and this is not necessarily an India thing at all, is that
Mhm.
how do you balance the tourism aspect of art consumption with the listen, I actually live here and it's the same in many ways as where you live. How much do we get into that? Because you
Yeah.
the reader have come here expecting a certain set of things, and I want to give them to you. But what if I told you that we're not so different and everything is
Mhm.
terrible here? I hope things are better for you where you are. um, but we can have a conversation about it. And it's a very interesting space to explore in any form of literature. And one of the things that I love most about say science fiction and fantasy is that you can do absolutely anything in there.
Yeah.
And the fact that the world is slowly opening up to understand that it's you don't have to follow a specific set of guidelines, because it is the literature of the imagination. um, you know Over in the last 20 years, I've seen not just books, not just SF and fantasy, but even comics and film, and all the new forms of storytelling on the internet um, evolve so fast and in such interesting directions that it feels like there's this absolute wealth of spaces where you can go as a creator.
Hmm.
And that's been very thrilling. I never think of myself as representing India in any way, because there are about 50 countries in here,
Yeah.
um, all
That
sandwiched.
that's a that's something I experienced because like I went to Mumbai for a wedding and then I went to New Delhi for the so it was like Hindi wife and a Sikh husband. And so we went to one wedding ceremony in Mumbai and then another wedding ceremony in New Delhi. And even just those two cities, it's like, holy shit, this is wildly different. You know, the wedding ceremonies are wildly different, but also just walking around on the streets is wildly different. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah, they're just different universes, and these are cities that are more similar to each other than most other cities.
Hmm.
Um, so because they are the biggest ones, and so a lot of the collective aspirations in them are broadly similar. So I don't understand India at all, and I live here. I've always lived here.
Yeah.
Um, so the idea of explaining it to anyone else is a very difficult one for me to even begin to approach. So my not solution, but my attempt at that is to try and focus on cultures that I do understand, um,
Hmm.
and that I have experience. So everyone in the city inside, for example, is based on someone who I actually know. Um, and I thought that for better immersion, it would be nicer to create each character out of three or four people who have something in common, all of whom I know, but who
Hmm.
I know quite well. Um,
Yeah.
because this is the kind of thing where details are very important, and I don't see it as representative of anyone. Um, because of course there are things that are kind of in the air, in the cultural atmosphere, that would be shared in common by a variety of people. But one of the reasons why, for example, the protagonists are people who are relatively privileged, and who are, say, they're both kind of Hindu, middle class, upper middle class, rich. um, it's because the reality that they experience is something that I might have common inroads to. The reality that more oppressed groups face is something that I can't even imagine now, and it would have
Right.
been unbelievably arrogant of me to imagine what it would be like 10 years in the future. Um, so I thought that while obviously they would the characters would slowly learn to engage with the world more, I didn't feel that for this book it would be right for me to um, take on the point of view burden of people who I cannot in any way help in
Hmm.
reality. For
Yeah.
more heavily fantasy science fiction work, I always think that authors should give themselves as much freedom as they like. Um, and tell the stories from the point of view of people that they have nothing in common with. But because I'd set about this goal of immersing into my actual world, these were constraints that I took on as well.
No, I mean that's understandable because ultimately this is not necessarily a reflection of India as a whole. It's a reflection of your experience within India, and like you say, uh, it's more true to yourself to represent what you understand and know about India. And for me, it's like that's why it came across as genuine. These characters, because these are people that you know, and you were able to create these amalgamations of different people and create this much more genuine reflection of your India. You know, and I understand it's like there's so many different strata in Indian society in terms of like economic hierarchies and you know like the differences in classes and all that kind of stuff and it's really complicated. you
Oh yeah,
know? And
class,
so,
religion, caste, language, gender,
yeah,
all of them. Like absolutely all of them. And it's yeah, and it's become increasingly hectic over the last decade, especially ever since kind of social media has really exploded. Um, the the fact that we live in very different realities, in the sense that you and I probably have more cultural touch points in common um, than my neighbor who's making strange construction noises upstairs. We just we because we consume a lot of the same media. We
yeah,
have a great set of shared interests, and we are talking to each other across the world over this digital platform. Um, I don't know what my neighbor's doing apart from construction-y work.
yeah.
I have
But
nothing in common with him.
yeah, but there's something that you did in the City Inside, which I really appreciate and respect, which is, you've hinted at it a little bit, but the fact that your characters, despite their privilege, they do over the course of the novel grow in such a way where they are engaging with the society around them. You present a lot of anxieties in terms of things like surveillance and privacy in relation to technology, or pop culture, social media, and the influencer culture, or government corruption and hierarchies, which is something that we've touched on as well. Climate change, even. Um, these are different anxieties that exist in your future of India. A lot of them exist in India right now. A lot of them exist around the world. And so these are commonalities that we can share. But something that you did, which I really appreciate, is the optimistic approach that you took to giving these characters the ability to grow in terms of engaging with their communities. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like, oh, wow, it's on this massive grand scale and they're going to change the world. It's like, no, people can effect the most change, at least from my experience, with those around them. And if you approach things optimistically, and if you influence those around you, that is the kind of small scale change and optimism that can have a ripple effect and grow into something larger eventually over time.
Thank you. I'm just so delighted and amazed that that filters through. Because that is exactly what I was hoping in a clumsy way to say. So I'm just very glad to hear it.
Oh no, I mean, I'm happy that you did that, because it's like I love that. You know, even if you want to call this cyberpunk, or what have you, this near future sci-fi, it is doing something that I appreciate more from the current wave of science fiction, post cyberpunk, and all this kind of stuff. Where it's like in the 80s and the 90s, there was a lot of pessimism. There was a lot of techno pessimism, especially. But now I think we're getting to a point where we're obviously faced with a lot of these technologies directly, but there's a lot more hope in terms of uh, what good these technologies can do, at least in the hands of human beings who have good intentions. You know what I mean? So it's like sometimes there's people who have really shitty intentions, sometimes there are corporations who have really shitty intentions, what have you. But on the local level, if people have good intentions, this technology can be an incredible tool for positive change on the world.
Absolutely, yes. And
Yeah.
and every time, and this is something that we feel quite heavily in say this part of the world, just and but it's true anywhere really, that how new
Mhm.
technology is immediately adapted to be used as a tool of say oppression and exclusion, right?
Yeah,
But at the same time, that same technology is also used in innovative ways to bring people together,
exactly. Yeah,
and to resist the oppression and the exclusion that it's also being used for. So, and the challenge really is which happens faster and which happens at a larger scale. So it's this constant back and forth between um, people trying to subvert the possibilities, the optimistic possibilities of technology and culture in general, um, to create mass oppression and to create mass control and drain of resources. And how fast can any resistance adapt to that? How fast can they
exactly.
subvert it? Who are the people who can help? We're all kind of trained to believe in heroes who will rise mysteriously to kind of lead the fight against the darkness, but that increasingly looks like successful PR campaigns after a victory. than it does during the actual process of any significant change happening. So um, part of looking at the various, huge problems with the world build I was doing, and wondering who on earth is going to save people from all of this, because it just doesn't look realistic, was the realization that small resistances and small acts of community, um, and understanding that people have different needs, and everyone, and
Hmm.
there are some people who are doing whatever they can, is what has led humanity anywhere out of whatever mess it's in, if they've been able to escape that mess in the first place.
Yeah.
We're all confronted with so much daily horror on the news, um, that even stepping away from the news and isolating is a perfectly understandable response.
Yeah.
But it's in that struggle to find that balance that a collective progress can be made in the times that we live in, and it's going to be hectic times across the world for a while. Um, and I'm
Yeah.
really, really hoping for calmer days at some point of time. Hopefully soon, but who
Yeah, but I mean,
knows? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the world, it has its ebbs and flows, and I don't think there's ever really a time of uh history where things have not been at least somewhat chaotic, you know?
Oh,
Even though someone
absolutely.
might say like, "Oh, like the 1950s," and say it's like, "No, that was the Cold
No.
War." It's like, what are you gonna say?
No.
So yeah, so yeah, it's just collectively we have to, in the words of Gandalf, do do what we can with the time that is given to us. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but for you, uh, coming from India, writing about India, I know you approach it from your perspective of India, not necessarily an Indian perspective of India. But for you personally, what are your hopes for the future of Indian science fiction and fantasy?
A lot of very exciting work is happening right now, and this is so I'm the next few years, the next 3 or 4 years, there's going to be a lot of work coming from South Asia that is getting published in the UK and the US. Um,
Hmm.
there's always been a steady, slow trickle of books here, but it's not something that gets mainstream attention in India for the genre that it's in. Sometimes
Right.
books are kind of genre independently successful, and then individual writers get attention. But what I like about it is that it's going in very different directions. So, for example, you have really lovely diaspora books coming out, which are also in different directions. Like, so let's say Tasha Suri and Vaishnavi Patel are writing fantasy books that are looking, re-engaging with history and mythology in ways that are very different from how we would in India. Because for us, the realities of how mythology is used politically and religiously as instruments of kind of not very nice things makes our relationship with the myths a bit more tense than it is for people who
Interesting.
live elsewhere, and have
Right.
and for whom it's a thread of cultural connection to their family's pasts. So
Right.
I think a lot of the most, I think the best mythological reinterpretation work will come out of the West. I don't think
Yeah.
it'll come out of India for a while, or at least even if it comes out, I don't think it'll be allowed to find a lot of mainstream acceptance. Um, and there's also writers like S.B. Divya, Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan, whose work is coming out next year, who are doing
Hmm.
such interesting things with the more science fictional aspect of it. I
Yeah.
love machinehood. I think that Lavanya's book, which is going to be called The 10% Thief, and is out from Rebellion next year, is fascinating. And it's not just India. There's a lot of South Asian work like Saad Hossain from Bangladesh,
Hmm.
or Vajra Chandrasekhara from Sri Lanka. They're doing this very interesting mix of science fiction and fantasy, and kind of looking at the societies that they're from. Um, but they've also managed to find publishers. Tordotcom is in fact has been bringing out Saad's work for a while, and is bringing out Vajra's from next year. So
Hmm.
what I like about the next few years of South Asian science fiction and fantasy is that it is going to be very reflective of the multiple cultures that you have here. So
Yeah.
so other writers like I hope you get to hear of them soon from publishers there. People like Tashan Mehta, Gautam Bhatia, Achala Upendran, who are doing wonderful work. Um, and I love that publishing in the West is kind of tentatively taking steps to expand the range of voices and open
Yeah,
more doors, because these doors were not
definitely.
open before. They were just not open before. Um, and So it's going to be reflective of the huge melting pot of diversity that we have in the subcontinent itself, and the
Mhm.
many writers who are perhaps second or third generation in the West, who have an entirely different set of ways of viewing the same cultural touchstone points. Um, and that's really all that I could hope for, because it would be wrong if it was, you know, Indian books in SF and fantasy should be like this,
Yeah,
because that is not at all what it's what 1/6 to 1/7 of the human species, right? It
yeah.
is it is going to be it's going to be next to impossible to find a unifying or definitive explanation for any of it, and we're all very
Mhm.
chaotic as well, which doesn't help.
But the beauty of it is, we talked about the connective capabilities of technology. A lot of this is possible because of that simple fact that you can find an agent across the world and probably Skype with them like this, or have a video chat with them like this, and get to know them, and then get connected with publishers, and eventually get published, and all of that through the funnel of this technology. That, obviously there are some bad sides to things. People manipulate and what have you, and take advantage of others through the use of technology. But the diversity of voices and perspectives throughout South Asia, even if they are second or third generation diaspora in other parts of the world, all of these voices can create a more you know, a broader perspective to non South Asian people of what might fascinate them about South Asia, or, perspectives that they might not have ever heard before, and voices that they've never read, and they can experience their work and appreciate it and look for more of it, and create an even bigger market that will attract more South Asian talent in the end.
Absolutely, and there are also more writers of maybe South Asian origin who don't feel the need to write about South Asia at all, and who
Mhm.
are just embracing the possibilities that the literature of the imagination that they work in give them. Like, I
Yeah.
think possibly, and of course I have no numbers on this, but I think possibly the most successful South Asian writer in the broader speculative umbrella is Nalini Singh, who I think lives in New Zealand and writes these
Mm.
incredibly successful paranormal romances. And I love that she's not felt the burden of representation and how do
Mm.
I showcase my culture to the world at all. I love that. It's what you know, the degree of adoption or non-adoption of any of the identities of any writer should, I feel, be a matter of their choice. Now, wherever they land is the right way for them, and
Exactly.
and it's fascinating, I think, to see just the range in a very small set of writers here in the much larger kind of list of writers from anywhere doing anything. It's fascinating to see that even given a very a small circle of definition, we all start crawling in different directions.
Yeah, because
um
that's just the nature of individuality, and
yeah,
everyone has their
yeah,
own experiences, and like you
yeah.
said, it's like the city inside is your India, but somebody else will represent their India, or even if they are Indian or South Asian, whichever country they come from, whichever culture, whichever historical background they have, they might not even decide to write about that specifically. They might go into paranormal romance, and have success and enjoyment, and fulfillment in that avenue, which is equally fantastic.
Oh, I also wanted to shout out Inder Pramit Das, who wrote The Devourers a few years ago, and who I have been pushing for a while to get his next novel done, because he's a beautiful writer, and I have no idea what he's going to write about. Um, and whatever it is, it'll be deeply strange and very beautiful, and I just hope he does it soon.
Fantastic. And to wrap up, I would like to ask you for three recommendations, one from each of your creative mediums. So a book, a film, and a comic.
Okay. So I just finished reading Nee Vo's The Siren Queen. I hope I'm pronouncing
Nice.
her name right. I love that. It is set in old Hollywood, and it is beautiful, and it is disastrous, and I loved it. Um, in terms of comics, I've been very out of touch. So I can't actually give you a comics recommendation right now because I have just been I've not been
You
in
have
touch. And also
you have Saga framed behind you. That's a good comic recommendation.
love Saga, but Saga is
Saga's
also, I mean,
amazing.
I don't know what's out right now. Saga was the last comic that I just, I've read it multiple times. I think the work that they do in Saga is just incredible.
It's coming back
um,
next year. So,
thank you for this
yeah.
news. I'm very excited.
Yeah,
In
they're gonna
film,
start working. They're gonna start working and then finish off the comic starting next year. So, yeah,
and it's so, and I mean, there's something that just always excites me about, just when comics decide to just go for everything at the same time.
yeah.
I remember when I read Sandman for the first time, and I think it was sometime
Oof.
in the late '90s. Like, wait, you can do this, you can do this in that's amazing. I want to do this.
Yeah,
was was what I felt. Um,
yeah.
Film wise, what did I just see? I just finished watching Moon Knight, which I really enjoyed, especially because the way that it handled the Egyptian aspect of it in terms of both the people behind the scenes and the way that they treated the culture. Which again, it's really nice to see. The superhero format, which used to be so restrictive, but has
Mhm.
also, of course, had lots of interesting work happening in it, especially since the '80s and the whole British invasion thing. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but it's nice to see that. It's nice to see that coming onto the broadcast screen, where normally things are much more restrained and much more constrained in terms of what they can do. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to watching that Michelle Yeoh movie, which hasn't come here yet. Everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yes, yeah. I heard amazing things about that movie. Yeah.
I want to watch it. As soon as I get the chance. So I'm going to recommend it because I know I'm going to love it, even though I haven't seen it yet.
I appreciate that. And I second Moon Knight. I think it's good that, superhero movies can deal with things like multiple personality disorder and just more character studies that are questioning the sort of sanity and morality of the genre, with something like The Boys as well. That's a really fantastic exploration of the darker side
Yeah,
of superhero morality. So it was really cool. But yeah, Samit, thank you so much for taking the time. I had a blast talking to you
I
and
had a blast. Thank you
yeah,
so much.
just no, it was an absolute pleasure. And yeah, I recommend everyone go check out The City Inside. That's out on June 7th via Tor.com. So yeah, go pick that up whenever you can. And thank you so much, Samit.
Thank you.